Donald C. White is the author of 2 New York Times best-selling presidential biographies, A. Lincoln, a biography, and the one you heard about that was auctioned off tonight, American Ulysses, The Life of Ulysses S. Grant. He has also written 3 award-winning books on Abraham Lincoln. White is a graduate of UCLA and Princeton Theological Seminary, receiving a PhD from Princeton University. He has taught at UCLA, Whitworth University, Colorado College, and Princeton Seminary. And best of all, Ron and his wife Cynthia reside in Pasadena. White is the author of a new biography, On Great Fields, The Life and Unlikely Heroism of Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, about which he will be sharing tonight. Please welcome him.
Thank you, Janet. I've been to lots of meetings in the last 3 or 4 months. I love the idea of the auction. That's terrific. And the miscellaneous, terrific. Well, let me anticipate one question before you ask it. Having written biographies of Abraham Lincoln and Ulysses S. Grant, why Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain? Well, a few months before the manuscript was delivered, I received a call from Brunswick, Maine. Has anybody been to Brunswick, Maine and visited the Chamberlain house? No? Oh, you have, okay. Well, it's quite a remarkable house. Chamberlain lived about 3 blocks from the main street. He moved his home so it would face the college and First Parish, and then he raised the bottom floor 11 feet and built a brand new first floor that would be able to accommodate what he wanted to be as the president of Bowdoin College. Well, I received a call from Nina Maurer, and she said she could hire as a consultant to rewrite the script that guides would use for the house. And she wanted to find out a little bit more, make it more personal, not simply architecturally. So at the end of the conversation, I asked her, I said, well, who comes to the Chamberlain house? And she said, about 60% of the people who come are great fans of Chamberlain. There's literally a pilgrimage to Brunswick, Maine. I said, and? Well, she said the other 40% have been wrangled in by their friends or relatives. So I know that you're all good, faithful members of the Pasadena Civil Roundtable, but maybe some of you have been wrangled in this evening. On July 2nd, 1863, in the midst of the pell-mell Civil War at Gettysburg, Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, lieutenant of the 20th Maine Regiment, found himself at the top of Little Round Top. His men had begun to run out of ammunition. Suddenly coming up from below was this much larger force led by the 15th Alabama. In the 90 minutes that then pursued that battle, this became an epic turning point because Chamberlain had been asked by Strong Vincent to defend the far left line of the Union Army. And that's what he did. As his men ran out of ammunition, and so many of you just know this story, why he raised his hand and offered just one word, bayonet. And the men charged down the hill and won a great victory. And after that, Chamberlain became the hero of Little Round Top. So we'll go to the next slide. I may remember this. Here we have Colonel Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, about 5 feet, 10.5 inches tall, an erect posture. He talked often about what he called his ferocious mustache. A handsome man. Go to the next slide. And here's his opponent, William Calvin Oates. In the biography, I tell the very different stories of these 2 men, different parents, different faith tradition, different education, and yet they both became remarkable leaders at Gettysburg and quite remarkable leaders after the Civil War. And we'll do the next slide. And here's a photograph of Little Round Top on July 3rd, the very next day. Now, I got an email this morning from someone who told me that he was going to take his family to Gettysburg for the first time this summer and asked the question, what should he see? Well, I spoke there in November, and they are now undergoing a $10 million 2-year renovation of Little Round Top to preserve it for the future. Because of Chamberlain, it has become the most visited place at Gettysburg. And it's almost been trampled over by the foot traffic. So they want to preserve it, they want to increase the signage. It's a 2-year project. I checked on it this morning, at least on the internet. It said it's supposed to open in the late spring of 2024. And yet, I call him in the title of the book an unlikely hero. What do I mean by that? Here is an amiable professor of a small college in far northern Maine, good-humored, attractive person, very much respected by his students, but not someone that you would thought might become this great hero. He was a man of deep Christian faith. He was a man of intellectual curiosity. He became fluent in 9 languages. Let me say that one more time. He became fluent in 9 languages. I've spoken in the last several months to several colleges, and I wanted to sort of tell these colleges, what was the curriculum that these people studied? Just unbelievable. And so much of it was done from memory. No one would have predicted that this professor would have become this great Civil War hero. He was born 50 years after the founding of our nation, and he believed in something called the Union. You know this, but I think most Americans do not. It's very hard for Americans today to understand the meaning of the Union for people in the 19th century. Surely it was a political idea, but it was almost a religious idea. And so men signed up to fight for the Union. This was the great battle. And you may know the story that before Abraham Lincoln, we always said the United States are, because in many ways the reality was the individual states. For Robert E. Lee, that was the reality. Lincoln changed our language, and so we now say, without even thinking about it, the United States is. Yet the vagaries of American memory meant that Chamberlain was largely forgotten. Gary Gallagher, who spoke to you not too many months ago, helped me discover that in 2 different pamphlets, really books or guidebooks on Gettysburg in the 1930s and the 1950s, Chamberlain was not even mentioned. Not even mentioned. But then the trifecta, and I'm sure you're familiar with these, began. The novel Killer Angels brought Chamberlain to the fore. Then the Ken Burns Civil War documentary based on the novel Killer Angels further heightened his fame. And finally, Jeff Daniels portraying Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain in the movie Gettysburg. But there was a pushback. As people began to swarm Gettysburg in the 1990s, some of the Park Service guides were a little put off by this. Wait a second, there's a whole lot of other people here that deserve their praise and affirmation. So I was told by one of the military historians there that sometimes in the 1990s, underneath the official uniform of the Park Service guides, they wore a t-shirt. Joshua who? Joshua who? Was this guy getting more praise than he deserved? As I started this biography, I became aware that the previous books on Chamberlain were what I would call a zoom lens. By that I mean they focused almost exclusively on the Civil War, on his exploits, his courage in the Civil War. What I've attempted to do in this new biography is to do what I call a wide-angle lens. I think that more than any other general, including Ulysses S. Grant, he occupied more different positions in his life before and after the Civil War. College professor, governor, president of a college, incredible speaker, and great writer. All of these things combined to what I believe is a very, very compelling story. But I also, at the beginning of my work, discovered this is going to be a prickly task. Because there are people out there then, but mostly now, who are arguing, wait a second, did Chamberlain fabricate? Did he exaggerate what he did? Was he truthful about what really happened at Little Round Top or what happened at Appomattox? And so I had to deal with these prickly matters and these criticisms. In my biographies, and there is an art to writing a biography, I have a couple of convictions that have kind of energized me in all the biographies I've written. The first is, I believe that American biographies recently skip very quickly, too quickly, over the life of a young person. Actually, Ulysses S. Grant once said the reason I do not read biographies is because they do not tell me the story of the young person who becomes the adult leader. Think of your own lives, whether you're 40 or 60 or 80 or however old you are tonight. Wasn't it when you were 16, 18, 20, 22, 24 that a lot of the basic beliefs and values were laid down in your life to which you still adhere? I think this was important. I didn't even realize it until I finished the book that of the 20 chapters, 5 are what I would call chapters on formation. How were those values formed in family, in church, in college? I want to find out the formative part of a person's life. A second conviction that I bring to this task is what I call the faith stories. I think these have been minimized, overlooked. For Abraham Lincoln, it's a remarkable story that ultimately becomes a Presbyterian story after he rejected the Christian faith, what many young people, your children, your grandchildren, may be doing today. For Ulysses S. Grant, even less known was that it's a Methodist story. The Methodist denomination was the largest denomination in America, and long before anybody thought of a national cathedral, the Methodists built a national church. And they timed it to be inaugurated when Grant was inaugurated. They inaugurated that church 4 days before Grant was inaugurated president. He was the son of Methodism. For Chamberlain, it's what we used to call Congregationalism. Today it might be called the United Church of Christ. His parents were kind of 19th century inheritors of a Puritan tradition. Now, Puritanism has suffered a bad press in recent decades, I think unfairly. In many ways, Puritanism at its best trumpeted the life of the mind. And this is Chamberlain. Chamberlain was encouraged in the life of the mind. And his Bowdoin College professors could balance their interest in the classics and their interest in the Christian faith. They all came together. Well, one other part of writing a biography for me is that there are pieces of a puzzle that have to be answered. I don't know what the pieces are necessarily at the beginning, but they will reveal themselves. One of the pieces of the puzzle is, how could this very mild-mannered professor become this risk-taking Civil War soldier? How did this person who so revered his own college education challenge that very education, both the curriculum and the teaching method, when he became a professor and ultimately when he became president of Bowdoin College? And perhaps the most interesting piece of the puzzle is Fanny, Frances Caroline Adams. Now, I think I've forgotten a couple of slides, so we better go forward. Here we are arriving at Bowdoin College. This is about an illustration of about 1850. And let's bring that story into play. Bowdoin College, like American colleges, was steeped in what was called a classical approach to education. Why Bowdoin College? Well, if you lived in Maine, it was a 5-day horseback ride to Harvard. And so people wanted their own college, and it was founded in 1808. And they believed that if you focused on the classics, they even used the metaphor, if you could become Greek, that would be a way of instilling the basic virtues in your education. We've had a lot of recent conversation, as well we should, as what's taking place in our own education. Up until almost the end of the 19th century, education in this country was all focused on character, building character, virtue, honesty, truthfulness, loyalty, magnanimity. We've walked away from that. And those are the values that really undergirded who Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain was. Well, I wanted to find out, well, why in the world would we be interested in this particular topic? And the real answer that I got was from a Harvard professor of the same time period who wrote these words, Professor Cornelius Conway Felton. The reason that we should write about becoming Greeks is he railed against a self-indulging age that tolerated a constant reference to self. Now wait a second, is that 1848? The problem was there right from the beginning. Let's say a little bit more about Chamberlain's upbringing. I want to tell this story. As a boy of 8 or 9 on a warm August day in Maine, as he's working with his father in the farm fields of Maine, studded with boulders and trees, he's leading a wagon led by 2 oxen. Suddenly the wagon is stopped. It's stuck between 2 tree stumps. He can't move it forward. The father calls out, "Clear the wheel!" Walking behind the wagon, he commands, "How am I going to do it?" The young boy replies, "Do it! That's how." And Chamberlain again and again and again would refer his life back to that conversation. Do it! That's how. That became his order for life. He grew up in Brewer, Maine, a town of just 1,000. I recall in the summer of 2017, I traveled from Pasadena, where I live, 3,096 miles, not by car or horseback or foot, to Maine to try to enter in. I'm really concerned that some, quote, younger historians believe they can do all this work sitting in their office at the computer. You gotta go there. What do I know living in Southern California about Maine? I needed so many people to educate me about what it must mean to have grown up in Maine in the 19th century. He grows up in a family that is deeply religious. What do I mean by that? One of the ways that they taught religion in those days was by the use of what was called catechesis. Catechesis was a method that came down from the Protestant Reformation. It was the memorization of 107 questions and answers, the Westminster Confession of Faith. Question 1, what is the chief end of man? Answer 1, man's chief end is to glorify God and enjoy Him forever. Oh, but your grandchildren will say, but I can look it up on Google. And so we've kind of moved away from memorization. Chamberlain understood that memorization was not something wrote. It was part of the mind. It was part of the heart. One day he went off to teach in a very difficult situation, and he said to himself, fortified by the Westminster Confession. So he joined the church when he was 16, but he said, I'm not a sudden saint. I don't have any dramatic emotional conversion experience, but this is part of who he was. When he arrives at Bowdoin College, in addition to this classical education, someone else arrived. Calvin Stowe, an alumnus of the college, was called to teach religion at the college. His wife was Harriet Beecher Stowe. They came together, and one Sunday morning in First Parish, it's still there, this beautiful wooden church, she had literally an epiphany in which she had the vision that she should be writing about what she'd experienced when she lived with her father in Cincinnati, the terrible stories of the enslaved who were trying to cross the Ohio River, get into the free north, or all the way into Canada. So she sat down and started to write what became Uncle Tom's Cabin. At first it was serialized in chapters in a magazine, but what she did on Saturday evening was she invited some of the students, Chamberlain was included, to come to her house to listen to her read chapters from what became Uncle Tom's Cabin. Obviously no one had any idea this was going to become this remarkably best-selling book. I don't want to overemphasize what happened, but I think in far northern Maine, this was Chamberlain's first exposure to what it meant to understand the terrible difficulty of the enslaved persons that were part of our society. Well, at Bowdoin College, as he was asked to direct the choir at First Parish, he suddenly was not looking at the choir, but he was looking at the organist, whose name was Frances Caroline Adams. And hers is an interesting 19th century story. She was born into a family in Boston. She was the 7th child. Her father was 50 years old enough to be her grandfather. and they did something that would startle us, but it was not all that unusual. They decided that she needed to be brought up in a family with much younger parents, so they literally gave her to their younger cousin, who was the pastor of First Parish in Brunswick. Well, I wanted to find out who is Fanny. She's a remarkably interesting person. And I'm always looking for a story, an anecdote, an illustration that will help us understand who is this particular person. If I may, I found this towards the end of my research for this book. One of her high school assignments for her teacher, Mr. Alfred Pike, was to compose a paper using verbs ending in FY. Now, she knew that Mr. Pike did not entirely approve of her humor. So this is what she wrote in her essay. This is to certify, notify, exemplify, testify, and signify my obedient disposition. And I hope that it will gratify, satisfy, beautify, and edify my teacher. And pacify, modify, and nullify his feelings of dissatisfaction toward me. Please do not exclaim, "Oh, fie," when reading his paper. Well, that tells you that at age 17 or so, Fanny was a person of spirited wit. But yet the other part of my research about her was to read her adoptive father's diary. Fortunately, he had a long diary. And over again, he would begin to write, "Poor Fanny, poor Fanny." For although she was a spirited woman, an intelligent young woman, she was gifted in music and art, she was also often overcome by depression. She had a terrible problem with her eyes. As a very young person, at the end of her life, she would be blind in both eyes. And so, poor Fanny. But Joshua and Fanny married. And when I did a book event in November in Princeton with my former professor, Jim McPherson, he said, "I think you've really written a biography of a marriage." So this is a very important part of this biography, but unfortunately, even though the good news is that people wrote letters in the 19th century, how are we going to do history today? On the other hand, there are absences of letters. People often burned their correspondence in the 19th century. Husbands and wives did not want future generations reading their letters to each other. Chamberlain also came to Bowdoin College with another difficulty. He was a stammerer, or a stutterer. This was a terrible, terrible dilemma for him. He, in a very much oral culture where a college education was very much based on recitation, when he would get to the letters B, P, or T, he just froze. He could not speak out loud. Just an amazing story. It's fascinating that 2 or 3 people have now approached me. A friend in San Marino has approached me and told me what it meant for him to be a stutterer or a stammerer growing up in the public school system. I don't think I fully understood it, even though I wrote about it, until several people have come and told me how awful this can be, how debilitating this can be. Well, one other aspect, and am I slowing down on my, let's go forward. Here we are. Here is the young student, Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain. I'll get a picture of him. Let's go forward one more. Here is First Parish, which is cheek to jowl to the college for 100 years or so. The commencement of the college was held in First Parish. That spire was blown off in the wind by the end of the 19th century, but it's a beautiful, beautiful church. All right, forward one more. Here's a photograph of Fanny, and I think you can see, how do you interpret photographs? Here is a very pretty young woman, but you can almost see some of the trouble that's there in her facial expression. It's hard to try to grasp it, and I think this photograph says a great deal. All right, let's go one more. Okay, we can stop there. Another part of doing a biography is to ask yourself the question, what has been overlooked in previous biographies? Well, when Chamberlain graduated from Bowdoin College, his parents had a deep division as to what he should do going forward. His father wanted him to go to West Point. In those days, you could go to West Point after you went to college, not necessarily as your college. There had been a long line of men who had served in the military in the Chamberlain family. His mother wanted him to be a minister or missionary. He chose to go to Bangor Theological Seminary, founded in 1814, one of the first theological seminaries in America. He went there for 3 years. When he graduated, he had invitations to serve 2 different churches. But at the same moment, Bowdoin College approached him and said, "Would you consider giving an address at our commencement? If you do, we'll honor you with a Master of Arts degree." And evidently the address was so remarkable that the very next morning they offered him a teaching position. So he did not become an ordained minister. So that 3 years has been given 2 sentences in all the previous biographies. Well, I have taught at a theological seminary. I've been the dean of a theological seminary, and I know people who go to seminary, whether it's Fuller Seminary right next door, who do not become ministers, but for whom the theological education is really important for them. It's part of their formation. I think it was for Chamberlain. Problem. If the seminary was founded in 1814, it went out of business in 2013. Where were the records? Fortunately for me, the Maine Historical Society in Portland had gathered the records together and put them into some sort of form that I could investigate them, and I give a full chapter to those 3 years. If the 4 years at Bowdoin were important, obviously the 3 years at Bangor Seminary were important. Well, here was the major professor, Enoch Pond. He was the key figure in this fairly small seminary. And another thing that I found was Enoch Pond offered a basic class in theology. Chamberlain kept 123 pages of notes from that single class, and he kept them for the rest of his life. And I found them at the University of Maine at Orono. Why would he keep these notes for the rest of his life? I think he kept them because they were extremely important to him. Well, after the Battle of Little Round Top, Chamberlain goes on to fight 10 months later in Petersburg. It's a terrible, difficult battle. And as he leads his men forward, he is suddenly hit through the left hip with a mini ball, which shatters blood vessels, scrapes his urethra and bladder, and sticks on the right side of his hip, does not exit his body. 2 physicians come, they were called surgeons in those days, come and tell him he will die. And at this moment, believing he will die, he writes this remarkable letter. This is Professor Chamberlain. Here's this letter. "My darling wife, I am lying mortally wounded, the doctors think, but my mind and heart are at peace. Jesus Christ is my all-sufficient Savior. I go to Him. God bless and comfort you, precious one. You have been a precious wife to me. To know and love you makes life and death beautiful. Cherish the darlings, 2 young children, and give my love to all the dear ones. Do not grieve too much for me. We shall all soon meet. Live for the children." I just find myself every single time I see that letter just kind of overwhelmed that he would write this letter to her in these words with these sentences, believing he would die. Well, fortunately, Tom, his younger brother, rushed over to the 20th Maine, found 2 other surgeons who came, who extracted the bullet from him. I'm told today there are doctors who've written about this, that Chamberlain had about a 10% chance of surviving these wounds. We know, you know, as you've read the Civil War, of the story of the amputations, which we think is the major thing. But actually, the major thing were the internal wounds that soldiers suffered. So when I was in Brunswick in November speaking about this book, I was again in the Chamberlain home, and in his office there, when he served as president, he had a couch. He often could not even sit erect. He had to lay down on that couch. The wounds were so terrible. He had 3 different surgeries that tried to remedy that situation. They never could remedy it. It was a terrible, terrible situation. He would finally die from the infections of the wounds The affections just came again and again and again and again. So it's almost hard to imagine. And yet, he never complained. One of his men who had served with him in the 20th Maine came to visit him about 25 years later, and he said, I didn't know that you had all, you never spoke about it. Well, of course he never spoke about it. This is who he was. He was not going to complain. This is part of his values. Well, now we go forward, and Chamberlain is now 8 months later, and the war has come to an end. It's the time of Appomattox. Grant has offered a magnanimous peace to Lee, and Grant and Lee have both left Appomattox, but there is the surrender of the Confederate troops. And Chamberlain has been offered the position of receiving that surrender. Now, this is part of the criticism. How is it possible this non-West Pointer would be designated to receive the surrender? Well, I had to check this out for myself, so I spent quite a bit of time at Appomattox, and Patrick Schroeder, the National Park historian there, has spent 25 years investigating this story. And I believe that what he believes, I believe, is that yes, Chamberlain was designated to receive the surrender. My teacher, Jim McPherson, said to me, well, not everything was written down in the last 24 to 48 hours as the war was coming to a close. And so Chamberlain is asked to receive the surrender. Imagine for yourself the Confederates coming forward. Here is John B. Gordon. His men called him the Gallant. He had risen, as Chamberlain had, with no military experience. He had risen almost to the top of Lee's command, and Lee designates him to lead the surrender of the Confederate troops. And as he does so, just think to yourself, I don't want to go beyond what I know, but I also want to try to intuit what must have been in Chamberlain's mind. I think he was very aware of the magnanimity of Grant and wanted somehow to follow that. And so the men come forward. Now they're only 3 to 4 yards apart from each other. Chamberlain is watching these Confederates, and they come forward, and suddenly he shifts his command from order arms to carry arms. It's the marching salute. And Gordon, just overwhelmed by this, can't believe this, just touches his sword to his toe. 30 years later, Gordon has become a very important person in the South, and he's written a great book on the Civil War, and he's speaking in Brooklyn, New York, and the New York Times records this story. And he's asked several Union generals to sit behind him on the stage at the Brooklyn Tabernacle. And as he gets to the climactic story of what happened in Appomattox, he suddenly turns and says, and this is the gentleman who offered this remarkable surrender to me. Now, what was he saluting? This is part of our contemporary conversation. He wasn't saluting the Confederacy. He wasn't saluting the cause. He was saluting the bravery of the Confederate soldiers. Now he returns to Maine. He's the hero of Little Round Top. I thought a lot about this. You all have friends who have served in whether it's World War II or Korea or Vietnam. For many of these young men, this is the highlight of their life. What are they going to do now they're 25, 28 years of age? Chamberlain returns to teach at Bowdoin College, and it's not really very satisfying as it used to be before the Civil War, but the Republican Party of Maine steps forward. Wouldn't it be wonderful to nominate the hero of Little Round Top as governor of Maine? Well, Maine had a strange gubernatorial system. The election was for 1 year, and I surveyed all the previous governors, and they'd all served an average of a year and a half. Chamberlain serves 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years. Almost no one had ever done that. He could have served a 5th year. But then Bowdoin College calls him to become president. He comes back to the college, which has been so important in his own formation, but he understands that after the Civil War and post-Civil War America, colleges, most all of whom were founded by Protestant denominations, this is a whole new world. And so in accepting his presidency, he offers an inaugural address in which he says this: the times have shot past the college. Left out of the current of living sympathies, she stood still, while the world at full flood and flushed with new life swept on. He told his audience the college had touched bottom. He asked two questions: how to rise again and how to begin. He said that one option would be we might confine our efforts chiefly to holding our own, strengthening the things that remain, and feel our way by cautious and imperceptible degrees. The second, we might accept at once the challenge of our times. He put the question in bold language: should the college conquer or should it die? This is the slide of Chamberlain as governor of Maine, and the next one is Chamberlain as president of Bowdoin College. Chamberlain believes that the modern current is science. The college must embrace the study of science in the last third of the 19th century. But for many alumni, the study of science challenges their religious faith. They're not sure they want to do this. And so Chamberlain receives a real pushback. After 2 years, he resigns from the college. But the overseers and the trustees refuse to accept his resignation. 3 years later, he resigns again. They refuse to accept his resignation. So he serves for 12 years as president of the college. And at his funeral, at his memorial service, at his death in the 20th century, the then president of Bowdoin College said, Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain was doing back there and then what we are doing now. He was offering a progressive understanding of education, which we did not understand and we did not accept, but it's just commonplace now to do what he asked us to do 3 decades before. Well, I want to close with one story that I think really says so much about Chamberlain and is really so unknown. We have been walking through, have we not, in our own time, this thought, something that we thought could never, ever happen in our American democracy, the idea of the peaceful transfer of power. That was just a given. Oh, it must never have happened before. Well, absolutely, actually it did happen before. It happened in Maine. So in 1879, the Republican Party is running for governor. They've been the strong party since the founding of the Republican Party in the 1850s. Their candidate won in September of the voting. They won the House, they won the Senate, but then a strange thing began to happen. It was called the Great Countout. The Secretary of State, who happened to be a Democrat, began to count out the votes. In one town, 5 representatives and 1 senator lost their seats because the results had not been signed in an open town meeting. In another, 5 representatives were eliminated because the candidates' names were listed with initials, not their full names. The votes in the Republican town of Skoheven were disqualified because the ballot was printed in 2 columns rather than 1. In another town, 2 representatives were counted out because of the misspelling of their names. Boy. In Portland, they lost 143 votes. In Lewiston, Saco, Bath, and Rockland, all the votes were dismissed because 3 aldermen instead of 4 signed the returns. The Republicans were furious. Let's see the next slide. This is the headline in one of the Republican newspapers. The conspiracy, revolution actually afoot, only awaiting the final act. Will they commit the monstrous crime? Well, the Constitution of Maine, in its own strange way, said that if there are 3 candidates, and the candidates were actually Republican, Democrat, and Greenback, the House will decide on 2, and then the Senate will vote on 1. So the worry was that the Democrats would now steal the election from the Republicans. So men began to march to Augusta, armed to the teeth. The governor, who happened to actually be a Democrat, sent for 20,000 rounds of ammunition to come from Bangor. He established a paramilitary force to surround the capital in Augusta to defend it from these insurgents. But he knew there was one man who could deal with it, and so he offered this edict. Major General Joshua L. Chamberlain is authorized and directed to protect the public property and institutions of the state until my successor is duly qualified. Duty, that great quality in Chamberlain's life, called him one more time. He arrives in Augusta on January 5, 1880. He found the White House, the State House, barricaded with heavy wooden planks. He entered and established himself in a small office. He was now the military governor of the state. In his unanticipated position, he made it clear that he had no intention of declaring who won or who didn't win. He would leave that to the legal authority of the Supreme Court of the state. He wrote to Fanny, "Everything is confusion here. Although I succeeded yesterday in getting a good many things straightened out, what vexes me the most is that our own people, Republicans, do not like to have me straighten things out." The confusion is captured in this slide from Frank Leslie's Illustrated magazine. This is what is taking place in the Capitol of Augusta. A letter from United States Congressman Thomas Reed offered a portrait of Chamberlain at this moment. The resplendent figure, shining like one of the suns of the morning, which has brought us this tranquil joy, is Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, to whom Lee surrendered. He described Chamberlain who walks the State House stairs, master of the situation. In a January 15 letter to Fanny, he confided to her of a bitter attack upon him in a Republican newspaper. He even heard threats to her. He said, "If you are afraid, contact the local police officer, Thomas Eaton, to have the police keep an eye on you in the house." On one frantic afternoon, as the insurgents began to rush the Capitol, the mayor of Augusta contacted Chamberlain. He said, "You've got to do something." Chamberlain stepped forward, and this is what he said. "Men, you wish to kill me, I hear. Killing is no new thing to me. I've offered myself to be killed many times when I no more deserved it than I do now. Some of you, I think, have been with me in those days. You understand what you want, do you? I'm here to preserve the peace and honor of this state until the right government is seated. Whichever it may be, it's not for me to say. But it is for me to see that the laws of this state are put into effect without fraud, without force, but with calm thought and sincere purpose. I am here for that, and I shall do it." And then the story is told that he opened his vest jacket and said, "If anybody wants to kill me for it, let him kill." And he stepped forward towards the crowd. Well, Nelson Dingley, a former governor who was there, said there was a breathless silence for a moment. Then a veteran in the crowd called out, "By God, old general, the first man that dares to lay a hand on you, I'll kill him on the spot." The crowd drifted away. And so I argue that although Little Round Top seems to be in history the crowning moment of Chamberlain, I think this was a greater moment. Little Round Top took place in 90 minutes. This took place over the famous 12 days of January. He wrote to Fanny the next day, "Yesterday was another Round Top." The Supreme Court on January 16 offered its ruling. The Republicans won the governorship. The Republicans won the House. The Republicans won the Senate. I was impressed by all the letters that poured in after this. L.T. Carleton, a lawyer in Winthrop, Maine, penned, "You have too long hidden yourself away from public gaze. Let me assure you that the old-time enthusiasm for you has not abated." Chamberlain had to be gratified when Ellis Spear, one of the members of the 20th Maine, wrote, "I laughed when I saw and heard the threats against you. The men who made them did not see you in the hellfire of Petersburg." Dennis Shapley, who was at Appomattox. "General Chamberlain, we were never so proud of you as now, not even when you stood upon the boundary lines and received the surrender of our vanquished brave foe." I like the words of Helen E. Killen, a leader of the Women's Club movement of Massachusetts. This is the way she characterized Chamberlain. "We see it possible for a man to be a statesman, a soldier, a scholar, a gentleman, and a Christian." Well, as we come to a close, and we'll move to the next slide, here we have what they called in those days the grand old man of Maine, riding his horse in a parade early in the 20th century in the streets of Portland. And I want to close with this image and these words. One more slide, please. In 1889, the men of the 20th Maine returned to Gettysburg. Monuments were put in place in 1882, but now they've come to dedicate these monuments. And Chamberlain, who was the man who stuttered and stammered, but then became professor of rhetoric at Bowdoin College, offered these amazing words which are now emblazoned on the Bowdoin College campus. Let's see the next slide. In great deeds, something abides. On great fields, something stays. Forms change and pass. Bodies disappear, but spirits linger. To consecrate the ground for the vision place of souls, and reverent men and women from afar, and generations that know us not, and that we know not of, heart drawn to see where and by whom great things were suffered and done for them, shall come to this deathless field to ponder and dream. As I've been finishing my talk over the last few months, my audience has helped me redraft a new conclusion. I thought I was writing a 19th century biography or a 19th century Civil War biography. I think this is a book and a person for our own time. As we struggle with our own question, what does it mean to be a leader? What values are inherent in who we want to be a leader? Chamberlain, I think, is a model of this. At the Union League Club in Philadelphia, a person came up to me and said, he said, I studied at the Wharton School of Business at the University of Pennsylvania. We studied Chamberlain. At the Union League Club in New York, a man came up to me and said, I'm a graduate of the Air Force Academy. We studied Chamberlain. So I've over and over and over again at the California Club in downtown Los Angeles, a man came up to me and said, at the Army War College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, we studied Chamberlain. So I believe that Chamberlain is not simply this 19th century hero of Little Round Top, but I think the values that he represents are so important for us today. Thank you very much. Time for a few comments and questions?
Yes.
And I want to be respectful of your time. Yes?
How did he overcome his stutter to be a master rhetoric?
Good question. How did he overcome his stutter? He had a professor who helped him, who told him actually that the Spartans sang their way through the stuttering. And he really worked on it. And I don't think, though, you ever completely overcome it. A man came to see me about 3 weeks ago who told me that he had grown up with a very authoritarian father who spanked the boys in the family and then precipitated his stuttering. But then he got into this terrible moment in the war in Vietnam where the commander said, get out with me, you're going to be the radio operator. He said, I can't be the radio operator, I can't speak. And at that moment, suddenly the stuttering disappeared. And he spoke because he had to speak. But I don't fully understand it, but he really worked on it. More difficult in his time because it was a very oral, verbal culture. Ours is more a written culture. Good, thank you. Yes, sir.
Hey, I read in your book, if we can believe the author, you said, that you quote Chamberlain as saying the thing that he missed the most was the Army.
Yes.
That he loved
Yes.
the Army more than almost anything else.
Yes. He did, but when the Army was being reconstituted, the Civil War very much smaller, and they were asked to nominate people to be officers, his name was right at the top of the list. But he realized with his health, he could not serve in the Army going forward. He certainly considered that, and it was a high moment of his life, but he had to step away from it.
Well, the point is that here is this religious man
Yeah.
who's, a professor and everything else,
Right.
and he missed the Army. He
Yeah.
thought this was,
Yeah.
this is where his calling could have been.
Could have been.
Yeah.
And one of the interesting things, this was true of Lincoln, but for Chamberlain was he did all the sports that boys did in those days, except one. The boys did gunning. He said, I cannot fire a gun to take the life of another, whether it's an animal or not. I cannot do that. So that set him apart from all the boys around him. Yeah. Interesting part of it. Yes, yes.
But in your book, you also said that during the Spanish-American War, he tried to volunteer.
That's right. Yeah,
They turned him down because of his age and health.
He's like 65 years of age when the Spanish-American War erupts and he volunteers. But William Calvin Oates, who's 62 years of age, I think, volunteers and he's accepted. He even volunteered for the Franco-Prussian War, which is the strangest thing of all. Yes.
This is sort of a literary. I noticed in that wonderful discretion dialogue of his summation That's like Ulysses by Tennyson. Have you read Ulysses by Tennyson? You need to look at that poem. Number 2, I notice this curriculum focuses on the Odyssey. What about his attitude toward the Iliad?
Wow, now I can't answer that question. I mean, obviously Greek literature would have been right at the foundation of their studies at Rhodes, but I don't know about that. I'm sorry.
Well, because the Iliad is, Iliad was on top of a mountain and the
Yeah,
mountain and it would go
it
down.
seems like such a parallel,
Yeah,
doesn't it?
yeah, yes.
Yeah. Yes,
To be fair, can you sum up the other Chamberlain in a sentence, perhaps?
the other Chamberlain,
The Civil War Chamberlain. Weren't there 2 Chamberlains that you mentioned?
well, there were several brothers, but I don't know that I mentioned another Chamberlain.
Oh, maybe I was thinking of chambermaid, I'm sorry.
Yes,
Know that he died in 1914, and that's a significant date. And I thought the only thing we learned from history is we do not learn. Appropriately, he died in 1914, the beginning of the Great War.
yeah, he died at the beginning of the Great War. He'd been part of the committee to put together the 1913 50th anniversary of Gettysburg. There's been a new book on that.
Was he a friend of Theodore Roosevelt? Roosevelt seems to be the type that would be a friend of his.
Ah, yeah,
Yeah.
very much so, yeah.
He got taught a lesson when his son died. He was a little bit quieter about war. Teddy Miller's a brave man. He didn't brag about it so much.
I think that's right, and to see his son's
equipment
grave
was
there
shot.
at the moment, oh my goodness, yes. Yes, yes.
Could you do some of the ages of him? Like, I was curious, like, how old was he when the war started? How old was he when he went back to Berlin? How old was he when this battle started out in Maine? And how old was he when he died? Just a couple of those.
Very good question. He was 33 years of age in the Civil War, and so there would have been not real criticism if he married with 2 young children, but he did not sign up. So what I didn't say was, and let me just read this quote because I think it's really important. As he wrote to the governor of Maine, he said these words, "I fear this war, so costly in blood and treasure, will not cease until men of the North are willing to leave good positions and sacrifice their dearest personal interests." In other words, this war can't simply be fought by boys. And then the governor offered him the colonelcy. And many of you know the story of what we call the political generals, where governors were looking for outstanding persons. They might be politicians, they could be a professor, who would have the ability to raise up a 1,000-man regiment. And so he offers Chamberlain the colonelcy, and Chamberlain turns it down. And he says these words, "I will take the subordinate position and learn and earn my way to the command." Wow, what does that say, Father? He could have been the colonel of the 20th Maine, and he says, "No, I'm not qualified to do that." So they bring in Delbert Ames, who's another Mainer, and the men are so disgusted with him, they want him to be the first casualty. Yes.
Did Chamberlain mislead his bosses at the university and tell them he wasn't going to sign up for the war, and then he did?
Good question.
And how does that
Yeah.
jive with his honor
Very good
system?
question. Did Chamberlain mislead his bosses or his colleagues at the Civil War? Yes, he did. And later on in his life, he apologized for that. He said, "I should not have done this alone. I should have consulted with them," because they knew that he was, in a sense, the future of the college, and they wanted him to be in this war, and they were taken aback. To be in the college, they were taken aback. He had just been promoted. He loved teaching rhetoric, but the more important position, interestingly, was professor of modern languages, which had been first taught by Longfellow. And with the new position, he was granted a 2-year leave of absence to study French and German in Europe. And he walked away from that to sign up for the Civil War. So you're right. This was a place where he should have consulted his colleagues.
Can I ask you too, do you think his portrayal in Gettysburg did him justice in the movie?
Basically it does, yeah, basically it does. Yes.
Can you describe, you talked about Fanny's depression a little bit
Yes,
earlier on.
yes.
Can you describe the state of the marriage in the last decades, and should we assume that he survived her?
Yeah. Well, I wish we knew more. As I said, Jimmy Pearson said, you've written a biography of a marriage. Yes, but because he's often gone, he's gone to the war, but she's often gone. It's kind of amazing. She's often off in Boston and New York shopping and leaving her children behind. And then there's this incredible river where he's governor of Maine. The governor at that time didn't have a mansion to live in. He lived in a boarding house. And so she didn't go to Augusta. Now, why didn't she go to Augusta? Well, she was a mother of 2 young children, so and her friends were in there. But then he writes this letter, and he said, you are talking about me to your friends, and you are saying that I have pulled your hair, that I have done this, and you have to stop talking about this. We're going to have a divorce. And then her correspondence goes blank. Oh, we wish that we would have heard her side of the conversation. Her letters are gone for 3 or 4 months. So how do you understand what took place here? It's hard to know. I believe that whatever did take place, the marriage came back together again, and because you can see the way they built that house together, the way they lived together, the correspondence that takes place between them. But that's a troubling part of the story. It is. Yes?
Besides Little Round Top, were there any other significant Civil War battles he was known for?
Yes, the Battle of Five Forks, for which he also won real commendation. And I can't go into it all here, but I was impressed by the way others spoke of him, the way others commended him. And it wasn't just some biographer or some historian, but the men who served with him or who observed him, especially Colonel Rice, who was a remarkable soldier who unfortunately died in the Civil War. The way they saw his ability, his courage, his valor, the qualities of his life. A lot of the others were skirmishes, where he was caught in these. Yeah. I want to be careful of our timing. How are we doing? Should we say thank you very much?
Yeah, I think so. See you on time.